Maya had rehearsed revenge like a speech. For months, she had imagined the curtains parting on the moment when she would step into her role. The wronged daughter answering the world with a smile that would fracture their complacency. Her father's ruin had been public. A business collapse blamed on his ethics and his enemies. The family that had once looked down on them, cold, polished, and practiced in contempt, still believed themselves untouchable. Maya wanted them to feel small. She wanted one man to feel the particular sting of being outmaneuvered, the heir to the Hargreaves' fortune, the man whose casual cruelty had been whispered about at boardroom lunches and private dinners. His name was Julian. The plan began as a half-mad joke among friends and hardened into a deliberate design. An arranged marriage. Maya would accept an engagement arranged quietly by a boutique matrimonial agency that specialized in social matches. The Hargreaves wanted a new social face. Maya wanted a face for her revenge. She would enter their drawing rooms as the mysterious bride. She would expose. She would reveal the hypocrisy, the lies, the small cruelties measured in invitations not extended, in internships denied, in subtle slights that build into a life of exclusion. The stakes felt justified. She told herself that the damage was proportionate. What no one had expected, least of all Maya, was that the man who agreed to the arrangement, who signed the papers and accepted the ring, was not the swaggering entitled heir from rumor and magazine features. He was Nathaniel Hargreaves, but not the one she had practiced humiliating. He arrived at her family's modest apartment on a drizzling Sunday evening with his hair neatly slicked, a blazer folded over his arm, and that odd, careful softness she recognized as camouflage. He moved deliberately, with a cane and an easy shrug of apology. According to the Hargreaves press, Nathaniel had been injured in an accident abroad years ago. Photographs of him in a wheelchair circulated with glossy captions about courage and resilience. That version of him had become a useful accessory to the family's softer branding. Maya's first glance at him was a study in miscalculation. The cane rested against his knee like a prop in a play he had learned to wield perfectly. His left leg bore the faintest limp, and he wore a brace thin as a whisper under his trousers. His right hand was steady, his voice measured. He smiled with reserve. He smelled faintly of citrus and old books. He spoke as if he had time. He was, at once, more complicated and less interesting than the caricature she had rehearsed to confront. She tested him with the first dagger of her plan. Small, deliberate slights. She described their future in terms that included accommodations and pity. She mentioned, in the casual way people mention mortgages and groceries, the charity luncheon where she would tell the Hargreaves patrons the truth about their family's negligence. She floated the notion of public accountability like bait. Nathaniel listened. He offered her tea and accepted her sarcasm with an inclination of his head, never flinching. He repaired a jammed seatbelt in her car with a patience that made her cheeks flush with something like admiration, then scolded her gently about safety. He learned quickly which of her jokes were armor and which were truth. Pieces of the plan unraveled because he refused to play the part she expected him to. He soothed her when she flamed. He accepted blame when she tried to provoke him into it. At dinner with the Hargreaves, where she'd planned to let subtle barbs roll like polished stones across their table, Nathaniel intercepted her barbed remarks with soft deflections, turning them into questions that made the room uncomfortable for a different reason, the sound of genuine curiosity. He asked about her father's work with a seriousness that smelled of late-night research. He gave her a look once, across a dining room chandelier, that was not pity but interest-real focused, almost affectionate. The first true fissure happened on a rainy afternoon by the river. Months into their contract, Maya had called Nathaniel on the lies. She wanted him to admit it publicly if possible so she could expose the moral rot she believed the Hargreaves embodied. They were walking beneath a bridge, the city blooded gray in the light, and she demanded a confession. Was it always performed? She asked. The limp, the speeches, the sympathy. Did you learn how to be broken because it helps you get what you want? Nathaniel stopped and looked at her like someone surprised by a new star in the sky. He set the cane down and walked onto steady legs for a step, an impossible, instinctive thing to do, and then laughed. But the laugh was not cruelty. It was a small, private redemption. You sound like someone who's already decided how it ends, he said. Are you prepared to watch the story you imagine, Maya? Because stories are never what we think when we plan them. She flinched at the use of her name. No one called her that without a license. She told him he was infuriating. He shrugged and, With a simplicity that cut through every irony she directed, he said, "I don't want to be admired for the wrong reasons. I want to be loved for the right ones." He didn't confess then. Instead, he began to show her slices of a life she had not considered, the small acts he performed to make the world a little less loud for others, the way he volunteered at an adaptive arts program for young adults, how he had discovered music therapy in the urgent poetry of a moment when someone's hand found rhythm. He told her about his mother's insistence on dignity, about a brother he had lost to addiction, about the way his father's name had been more armor than history. He spoke of vulnerability not as an accessory but as a habit of attending to the world. The revelation, when it came, was not a dramatic televised confession. It happened in the quiet way truths often do, folded into ordinary acts. One evening she found, on his phone, a photograph of a studio filled with canvases. The caption read, "For Camellia Light Keeps Growing." Notes in his handwriting, pages of an essay about disability and agency, drafts that humanized the phrase living with limitations. In a desk drawer she found a notebook with the names of people he'd helped, listings of times he'd arranged accessible transport or camp scholarships. The evidence did not prove the lie she had sought. It dismantled the lie she had believed. But there was a lie. The limp was not always real. He had been injured. He had relearned walking. He had practiced stillness. The world's appetite for a story had pressed on him until he decrafted an identity that fit other people's expectations. Whether that constituted fraud or survival he could not say. What he did admit, finally, was that for a while adversity had become a convenient lens that people expected him to keep. "It gave me purpose," he said. "For a while I let it do that. But then I noticed I was living for their pity, not the people I loved." Her revenge faltered because it had no target left to pierce. The Hargreaves' cruelty was still real, threaded through their years of influence, but striking at the son who loved them in his own flawed, patient way felt like hitting a mirror. She had wanted to humiliate their pride. Instead, she confronted the softer truth. People adapt to expectations. They build identities that can be a prison or a shelter. What transformed everything, though, was not moral deducement. It was the way he cherished her. It was in the practical things that made her world warmer. He learned to brew her coffee exactly the way she liked it, with a splash more milk and the faintest twist of cardamom. He left sticky notes where he thought she might look for encouragement on the bathroom mirror, in the refrigerator notes that reminded her to speak kindly to herself. He took her to obscure galleries and listened not to impress but to be educated. He asked about the things she felt ashamed of and treated them like fragile friends to be honored, not trophies to be displayed. Maya's armor cracked in the company of these small acts. She had trained herself to interpret tenderness as a weakness in others, and she had wielded cruelty as a scalpel. Nathaniel's gentleness was not a gamble, it was a practice. He noticed things. He noticed when she tightened her jaw and when her smile was forced. He suggested small changes, a therapist she might trust, a return to painting she used to love, and then supported her experiments without judgment. When she tried to articulate the reasons for her original plan, he listened, then asked, "What do you want besides revenge, Maya? What is the life under the vendetta?" That question was like a bright, dangerous knife. She did not have an answer at first. Then, in the stillness that follows rupture, she found a life that wasn't structural nor strategic but simply quieter. He taught her an economy of gentleness. She taught him the rhetoric of directness. Together they learned to argue without weaponizing tone. He learned to accept her anger when it was honest and to withstand it when it was performative. She learned to trust his steady presence like a scaffold upon which to climb. Their marriage, formalized in a small ceremony where her father gave her away and the Hargreaves family attended awkward smiles, assembled like dutiful ornaments, was not a victory lap for Maya's revenge. It was a compromise that had been forced into being by consequence and curiosity. People expected fireworks. The real, lasting thing was a slow charting of attention. It felt unspectacular at first, the day-to-day cement of a life. He charmed her the way a careful gardener tends an invasive vine, patient, persistent, never cruel. The conflict did return, as it must. Old enemies prowled through their new day's friends who once whispered had not forgiven her for marrying the Hargreaves. Donors sent passive-aggressive letters demanding philanthropic showmanship. She still remembered the burns of exclusion. He still fought with his father, with the family's appetite for image. There were moments she saw the old Maya sharpen at the edges. He held up a mirror. "If you become the thing you hate to get even, What does that do to the part of you that loved your father? His words were not condemnation, they were invitation. The revelation that cemented their bond was not a theatrical reveal but an act of courage. When Maya was offered an opportunity to testify before a board about corporate malpractice, an opportunity she could use to torture reputations, she accepted, not to renounce justice but to insist on accuracy. She spoke with a quiet ferocity. She told the truth about her father's mistakes and the systemic failures they had revealed. She did not seek to burn the Hargreaves, she sought to change the structures that produced cruelty. Nathaniel sat in the front row, his hand in hers, visible as witness, not armor. Afterward, she felt lighter. People lauded her candor, people criticized her restraint. The Hargreaves family learned, slowly, that being wealthy was not mutually exclusive with being accountable. Nathaniel's father still resented the attention. He still made the occasional public gaffe, but his son, No, the man she loved, began to exercise influence in ways that mattered. Accessible funding for disability arts programs, scholarships that required no performative gratitude, support for small non-profits that the Hargreaves once ignored. Love, in their house, became a ledger of small mercies. They grew into routines that were honest, Sunday mornings with newspapers and long breakfasts, argument-free walks through the city's lesser-known parks, quiet vacations where they bickered about which books to bring and left with more than they started. Maya learned to measure victory not by the awkwardness she could inflict but by whether she could sleep, untroubled beside the man who had taught her to spend her energy on repair instead of retribution. Years later, when a young woman came to Maya seeking guidance, an angry, brilliant child from a family in ruins who wanted to dismantle the pillars of the socially entrenched, the older woman shared her story without the theatrics she had once rehearsed. She told the newcomer's tale plainly, that vengeance can be an anesthetic that keeps the wound from healing, that mercy and accountability are not opposites, that love is sometimes patient enough to demand a better self. Nathaniel, watching from the kitchen doorway, smiled at the room like a small son. He still had his cane on occasion. His limp returned briefly after a surgery and then faded. There were days when grief arrived for reasons neither of them owned. There were days when the Hargreaves' name still felt heavy like a crown that wasn't theirs to bear gracefully, but in the soft domesticity of their home, in the small acts of cherishing and the deliberate kindnesses he paid like a quiet tax, the arranged marriage born of convenience and calculated plans had become something neither of them expected. True love that had survived when they decided together to be better than the stories they had been given. Revenge, Maya realized, had been a necessary teacher. It had shown her where the pain was, but the life she wanted, humane, stubborn, generous, was quieter than revenge and far more relentless. Nathaniel did not save her by being a phony, disabled heir. He saved her by refusing to be the caricature others wanted and by choosing, as a practice, to cherish the woman who had once marched toward him with a plan to wound. In the end, she forgave him and herself, not because they deserved it, but because they both decided to try.